alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. It is God who does the action in this passage of making the unregenerate or dead in their trespasses and sins person, making that person alive. You know, one problem, though, that sometimes people glean from this text when we see that, yes, it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And, you know, we sometimes have, sometimes we can lean one way and say, well, you know, I do have something to do with my salvation. Or sometimes we can go too far and say, well, I have nothing to do with my salvation. If we go too far, we will come to the part where we say, well, then it is by grace that I'm saved. So it is by grace that I'll keep being saved, so I can continue on doing whatever I want. Now, Paul makes this very clear over in Romans chapter 6. He says this, because I don't want anybody to get from my teaching on salvation by grace through faith, it would be a terrible thing. Anybody walk away from this thinking that they can continue on in the same way that they were before they were saved, continuing on in sin. But Paul says in Romans chapter 6, he says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? You know, as a Christian, when we are made alive by Christ, something needs to take place, some change needs to happen, because we cannot justify sin, continue on in justifying sin by grace. That is why Paul says, by no means. Jonathan Edwards said something once, a great preacher, said something once, and I think that it really connects with this idea of the fact that we are saved not of ourselves. We are saved as a gift of God, by the will of God. In fact, that's what even Paul says in chapter 1, verse 5. He said, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. But Jonathan Edwards said this about the condition of man before salvation. He said, you contribute nothing to your salvation but the sin that made it necessary. You contribute nothing to your salvation but the sin which made it necessary. The reason that we are saved is because of our own sin. We didn't cause God to love us. It wasn't because we were lovable. In fact, when we read back over verses 1 through 3, you see that we were very unlovable. We were enemies of God. We were serving the enemy of God, Satan, the deceiver. But it says that God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us. It wasn't because we were lovable. It wasn't because we got ourselves to a place where God could accept us. No, rather, we were sinful human beings, depraved, unable to come to God. The only thing that we contributed was our own sin. But it was God who was rich in mercy, and according to his will, that we were made right with God. So, we understand that we were dead in our trespasses and sins. We were like the world. And then, we were saved by grace, through faith, as an action taking part on, or God taking action into our lives, giving us faith. Because he says here that, and this is not your own doing. So what is not our own doing? We see that the grace by which we are saved, so our salvation, the grace by which we are saved, and the faith, all of that is not of our own doing, but rather it is from whom? The gift of God. So we see that we were once dead, and now we are made alive by grace. So, continuing on in this passage, we understand what a life looks like before salvation. We understand now a little bit better what happens at salvation. But now, what do works have to do with our salvation? You know, because it would be wrong of us to assume that just because we are not saved by works, it would be wrong to assume that we don't have to do works, or that works play no part in our own salvation. So, Paul continues in verse 10, he says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So, what is it that a changed life is defined by. It is not defined by following the pattern of this world, but rather by renewing our minds and serving God by good works. A good place to go. I don't have time to go to this currently at this opportunity to share with you all. But a good place to go if you want to understand more the relationship that works has with our salvation, because there is a relationship there. But if you want to understand that better, James in chapter 2 explains greatly the understanding that faith without works is dead. True, authentic faith is one that does good works. And so we need to understand that real, living faith has works as a result of salvation, not so that we might be saved. In fact, God saves us in spite of ourselves because we were so sinful, but through that, God saves us so that instead of doing these works the works that are evil apart from God, instead we are doing the works that glorify God. So authentic, true salvation is defined by doing good works, not to save the sinner, but to be evidence to the world that we truly are saved. Because let me say something real quick. You know, if we continue on living as we were before we were saved, there are implications to that I'm going to get into in my conclusion. But a very important thing is to question, you know, how is the world, why would the world come and want to learn about Christ? Why would they ever want to hear anything that we have to say when we are living exactly how they are? Because if we act as the world acts, then there's nothing unique or special about Christianity. But rather, the world will know that we are the disciples of Christ by our love. So once again, a good place to understand both the actions of the non-believer, the works of the non-believer, as compared to the works of a true believer. You can also go back to Galatians chapter 5, where we see the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are all things that define what a truly saved person is. Now, let me be clear, though, that we are not going to be perfect after salvation. There was a long time where I, as a teenager, was really upset with myself because I was like, am I really saved? You know, how can I really be saved if, you know, I might struggle with something at some point in my life, or, you know, I'm having a hard time understanding these things. I will not be perfect as a Christian. However, something very important to understand is that the Christian life is not about perfection. However, it is about direction. Because if we are still following the pattern of this world, then our direction is wrong, and that is not the direction of a truly saved person. However, while we still struggle with sin, we fight sin. Even the Apostle Paul admitted that he said that he was the chief of all sinners. Even though we still struggle with sin, waging war against sin, if we are headed and striving to put to death sin, then you know that you're on the right track. That is a very comforting thought, is that we are not saved and then have to be perfect afterwards, but we strive in all our ways to put to death sin and to live a holy life that is pleasing to the one who saved us. Amen. So true salvation, what is it defined by? It is defined by living a holy, righteous life before God. And holy, that word holy carries the idea of being distinct, of being set apart. So we are holy, meaning we are set apart from the world. As God is holy, he even says in his word, to be holy, for I am holy. So we are to be distinct and set apart. And then we are to show proof of our true, genuine conversion and salvation in Jesus Christ by doing these good works. In fact, I like this as I was reading over this text this morning in preparation for today. You know, I noticed something really interesting, is that in verse 2 he says, in which you once walked, and he is speaking of walking in sin, walking in our trespasses and sins.